This is our second week looking at Nietzsche's genealogy of morals. Last week, we considered Nietzsche's account of the origin of Christian morality. Nietzsche proposes that there were a set of people in society who were better off than others. He thinks the terms good and bad originally applied to the characteristics that made the people who were better off, and that the people who were less well off created the terms good and evil in order to get revenge on those people who were better off. Specifically, by applying the term evil to all those characteristics that made the people who were better off, better off. Now, I think there's a number of questions left open by Nietzsche's genealogy. One question is, why did the aristocrats or the masters in society come to accept the new slave morality? In other words, how did the priests win? Nietzsche's claim is that they were originally the leaders of the less well-off in society. So how did the less well-off in society come to assert dominance over the better-off in society? How did their moral system come to win out over the moral system of the aristocrats or the masters or the nobles? Now, I think we can refine this question even further by looking at Nietzsche's criticism of the philosophers who he calls the English psychologists. So this is on pages 395 and 6. So Nietzsche is aware that he's not the first philosopher to propose a genealogy of morals. So Nietzsche explains that the English psychologists proposed the following genealogy of morals. The English psychologist's account begins in the non-moral situation where people perform actions that are beneficial towards others, and other actions that are selfish or egoistic. The English psychologists propose that the recipients of these unselfish or unegoistic behaviors are motivated to convince the people who perform these behaviors to repeat them. So the recipients of these unselfish behaviors invent moral terms, the terms good and bad or good and evil, and they use these terms as if by classical conditioning to get people to perform more egoistic actions. So whenever someone performs an action of helping others, the person who's helped, the recipient of this action, applies the term good to that unegoistic behavior. And, according to the English psychologists, we've all subsequently forgotten how the terms good and bad were introduced, and we've come to think that unselfish actions are just intrinsically good. Right, so like Nietzsche's genealogy, this is an account of how the terms good and bad could have arisen out of a previously non-moral situation. Now Nietzsche wants to criticize this account of the origin of the terms good and bad, and his criticism is that this account is unhistorical. So now, I don't think the criticism here is that the English psychologists have failed to provide historical evidence that this genealogy took place, because Nietzsche himself provides no historical evidence that his genealogy took place. Instead, what I think Nietzsche means by unhistorical is that the English psychologists' genealogy makes no reference to human motivation. Right? The English psychologists' genealogy leaves it completely mysterious why anyone would have forgotten the origin of our moral terms. But now, if this is Nietzsche's criticism of the English psychologists, then he owes us an account of the human motivations behind our coming to accept slave morality. So more specifically, can we identify the human motivations behind the nobles or aristocrats coming to accept slave morality? And can we identify the motivations behind the slaves coming to forget the origins of their moral system? And I think this is what Nietzsche tries to do in the second and the third books of the Genealogy of Morals. In the second book, Nietzsche asks us to consider the relationship between a creditor and a debtor in a pre-modern society. Nietzsche writes on 412 that the debtor, in order to inspire confidence that the promise of repayment will be honored, pawns something to the creditor. In particular, Nietzsche writes, the creditor could inflict all sorts of dishonor and torture on the body of the debtor. Now, Nietzsche asks us to consider why it is that suffering is considered a compensation for debts. And Nietzsche's answer to this question, which he writes on 413, is that making someone suffer is pleasure in its highest form. Nietzsche writes, to see somebody suffer is nice, to make someone suffer is even nicer. So Nietzsche's thought here is that when one is strong, one enjoys overpowering others. Or when one is smart, one enjoys outsmarting others. Now, Nietzsche asks us to consider what happens to this instinct to overpower others as soon as modern society imposes its laws on it. Nietzsche's thought is that modern society's laws are put in place in order to keep everyone safe, and so in order to protect the weak from being overpowered by the strong. So the question is, what happens now to the strong person's instinct to overpower the weak? Now Nietzsche writes, in a passage that surely inspired Freud, on page 419, that all instincts which are not discharged outwardly turn inwards. So Nietzsche writes that the bulwarks with which the state organizations protected themselves against the old instincts of freedom had the result that all those instincts of the wild, free, roving man were turned backwards against himself. So the thought here is that when someone has strength, they seek to overpower someone. But when they can't overpower anyone else within the confines of a modern law-governed society, they try to overpower themselves. So in this way, the instinct to make someone else suffer is turned inward, and the person that I try to make suffer ends up being myself. And now, there might be a variety of tactics that I can use to make myself suffer. But Nietzsche thinks the best way that I can make myself suffer is Christian morality. So someone who has strength and wants to exercise that strength in making someone suffer can make himself suffer by taking the term wrath and applying it to his strength. So what we have here is Nietzsche's account of why the aristocrats in society would come to accept slave morality. Right? The aristocrats have all these characteristics of strength and beauty and taking pleasure. They're unable to use these characteristics to seek power over others. So they need to find someone to overpower. And since, within the confines of modern society's laws, they can't overpower anyone other than themselves, they instead seek to overpower themselves by inflicting slave morality upon themselves, by calling themselves guilty for having and trying to exercise all of these characteristics of strength and beauty and pleasure-taking. Okay, so that's Nietzsche's account of the human motivations behind the masters coming to accept slave morality. But what Nietzsche still has to provide us is an explanation of the human motivations behind the masters and the slaves alike forgetting the origins of our moral system. The key to Nietzsche's explanation of this is on page 424, where Nietzsche says that it's a basic fact of the human will that it needs an aim, that it prefers to will nothingness rather than not will. So Nietzsche's thought here is that everyone suffers in life. The weak suffer due to their own weakness. The strong suffer because they inflict suffering upon themselves. And Nietzsche thinks all suffering cries out for explanation, right? The thought is, suffering might be bad, but what's worse than suffering is meaningless suffering. Nietzsche writes on 435, man, the bravest animal and the most prone to suffer, does not deny suffering as such. He wills it. He even seeks it out, provided he is shown a meaning for it, a purpose of suffering. And now Nietzsche's claim is that we've all accepted slave morality and made ourselves forget its origin because slave morality provides a meaning for our suffering. How does it provide meaning to suffering? Well, the strong, who are making themselves suffer, they can explain to themselves, I'm suffering because I'm wrathful, or because I'm vain, or because I'm slothful. And the weak, who are suffering in truth because of their weakness, can explain to themselves that the real meaning behind their suffering is ultimately due to their goodness. Okay, so what I want you to think about when you're writing your essays this week is, first, how plausible is this account of the human motivations behind our coming to accept and forget the origins of slave morality? Second, I want you to put this account in the context of Nietzsche's overall genealogical critique of Christian morality. Are there any holes in the argument that we looked at from last week that are filled in, either adequately or not adequately, by the account we've looked at this week?